Hey guys, and welcome to the video. In this video, we're going to be talking about FaunaDB and how you can integrate that with your NEXTJS applications. Now, FaunaDB is actually built for the Jamstack, so it's going to be the perfect kind of database for your NEXTJS applications. So by the end of this video, you're going to be able to read data from your FaunaDB as well as insert a new row into a collection. Now, if this sounds interesting to you, stick around as we travel through the world of Fauna and how you can use it in NEXTJS. So before we get started into how to use FaunaDB and how NEXTJS seamlessly integrates with it, we should talk about what FaunaDB is and why it's different than, say, your standard client-to-server relationship. So it's basically a giant serverless function that you can call to update your collections, insert, read, delete, all those things that you can do with a regular database, except from it's built with serverless functions in mind. So a good example of this is the client-to-server relationship. Now, back in the olden days, before even I was a developer, we had something called the monolithic and client-server relationships. Now, in the 70s, what happened was the application did all the business logic and the database kind of stayed behind, and then the terminal was presented with whatever data you needed. Then in the late 80s and 90s, we started using databases for business logic and then doing the presentation to the computer, which is slightly different than before, where everything was handled in the application. Then the three-tier system came in, and this was like the 2000s and until relatively recently. So you would have the database at the bottom, the app server would do all the business logic for you, and then the web server would do the presentation. So just think of that like a node server and then something displaying it on the front. And obviously then you have the REST version of that where it's all wrapped in the REST server and it's displayed to your users. Now, the way that this works now is client serverless is pretty special. So the browser and the mobile does the presentation logic. The CDN also does some of that. So it will, serve up cached versions, or it will serve depending on what country you're in, all those kinds of things. Then the database and the compute, which is, a resale, will do all of the business logic for you. And then finally, you have services that you can use like Twilio or Stripe, etc., etc. So you can imagine it as just a bunch of little microservices maybe, and each one of those does its own thing, and you can just tap into them depending on where you are in the browser, versus the other way when you're looking at this three-tier where you have to have the app server involved at all times. Now we've talked about that, let's go ahead and create a FaunaDB account and create our first database. And once we've created the database, let's go and move that to the NEXTJS app and start showing how you can use serverless functions to get the data and display it to the users. So once you've created your account, what you'll get is a screen that says create your first database, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So click the create new database and then give it a name. And the database cannot contain any spaces. So let's call this next with fauna. And we're going to use the pre-populated data. So go ahead and click save. And in a few seconds, you'll get this screen. Now in this screen, you have two pieces in this dashboard that's important for us. And that's the indexes and the collections. Now the collections you can think of as tables, and the indexes are obviously just like indexes in any other database. So inside of here, you will see that there's a few customers, and inside of the customers, there's a bunch of different data here. First name, last names, addresses, telephone, and even your credit card numbers. And that's imagine that you've made an order, and this is the data that you're giving out. So now we have this, let's move this in to our NEXTJS app. So here we are in our NEXTJS application. And I just used the create next app through npx to create this, and then just removed everything that was in this return functionality. So what we're going to do is we're going to create the serverless function and then come back into this code and display it so that we can see what comes back. So if you've never created a serverless function before, it all happens inside this pages/API folder. And what we're going to do is create one for get customers, and then we're going to create one later to add a new customer. So first, let's do the get customers. So create a folder called get customers. And inside of there, we're going to create a new file called index.js. And now we have this. This is where all our serverless function is going to happen. But first, we need to install the FaunaDB client so that we can use that to make the request. To do that, just do npm install, and it's FaunaDB. And once you've installed that, we can go ahead and start running our functionality here. And the first and most important is to import FaunaDB, and that's going to be require FaunaDB. And once you have this, we can actually use this to create our query as well as make the request for the query. But before we do that, we actually need to create a secret, and the secret is going to be inside the .env file. So let's go back to our Fauna dashboard and create the secret and then put it inside of our .env. So here we are inside of our dashboard, and you're just going to go ahead and go down to security and then click the new key button. Make sure the database that we're using is the correct one. And you can leave the role as admin. And if you want to give it a name, that's fine. It is optional, so I won't do it. Once you've created your secret, go ahead and copy that and drop it into a .env file with the following name. It's going to be FaunaDB_secret_key. Go ahead and save that in there. And while we're also here, we're going to use Versailles to do our deployment. So what you want to do is go ahead and log in by typing the word Versailles and hitting enter. And once you've done that, you're going to add this to the secrets. To do that, type the word Versailles secrets add, then the same name as you have up here, and then the key as well, and hit enter, and that will be added to their store so that you can use it in the future. So now we've done that, we're actually going to use that. So do process.env.FaunaDB_secret_key. Then we can actually start making our queries. So to do that, do constq equals FaunaDB.query. And that will give us the ability to make queries. And then we need to create the client to actually make some of these requests. So to do that, you're going to do const client equals new FaunaDB.client. And then we're going to pass in this secret right here. So just go ahead and open some parentheses and type the word secret. So now that we've done our secret, our query, and our client, we're ready to actually do the meat and potatoes of a serverless function. Now, all serverless functions start the same way. Module.exports, and then async, request, response, and then a set of parentheses. Now, every time you make a request, this part of the functionality runs. And that's what's so special about serverless functions. So you can imagine that it's very easy to write a quick query to something and just not have to worry about the function name or whatever you need to call it. It's always the same. Module.exports equals async request response. And Next.js is smart enough to be like, oh, you've made a request to this API, get customers. This is the functionality I need to use, and anything above here is going to be used as a variable. So I always like to start mine off with a try and catch, and the reason is I want to be able to handle if any errors do occur. And the way we can do that is just by doing this try catch, and inside of here we're going to write our good path. And then inside of here, we can write a bad path. So first we need to actually connect to the database and make the query. So to do that, we're just going to say DBS is await client, which if you remember correctly is the client to the FaunaDB dot query. So we're going to make a query, and then we're going to use this FaunaDB query to actually do the query. So dot map means we're going to iterate over every result that shows up. Then we're going to give it the ability to paginate in case there's many results. Then we need it to match a query, so do q.match. And then inside of that, we're going to do a q.index, because we're actually going to use an index to do this. And we happen to have one called all customers. And all customers is the source that we want to use. So once we have that, we can then do a ref equals q.get and then ref. And this basically looks up each result by its reference. And now we have that, we can say, okay, I have this query, what happens if there's a good path? So we can just do a status of 200 and then set the DBS data as JSON. And then if there's an error, we can do a status of 500. And then we can also do .json and say error, and then error.message, and then we'll know exactly what the error message would be. So just to briefly recap everything that we've done here, now it's kind of tidied up. We've said we want to make a query, and we're going to use q.map, which will iterate over each result. Then we're going to make sure that it's paginatable. Then we're going to ask it to match this index of this type, all customers. Then we're going to use that to actually look up each result by its reference. And then finally, we're going to respond back. So let's make the request. First, we need to import a few things. So let's go ahead and import useEffect and useState. And those are coming from React. And as you know, Next.js is part of the React family. It's just a framework over the top. So we're going to use these to make our requests. Then inside of here, we need to set our useState variables. So let's do data and then set data. And we're going to set those to originally just an empty array. So now we have that. Now we actually need to create a request out to call this serverless function. And we're not going to do it inside of this useEffect, which in some standards might be okay, because I want to actually use this later on when we add a new user to get the latest data. So let's create an asynchronous function. And the async function is going to call getData. And that getData is then going to make a request. And that request is going to just make a call to that functionality. So we can do await fetch. And then the way to call these is to put a slash here, API slash whatever the folder name is. So in our case, get customers. And what happens here is Next.js is smart enough to go, okay, we're trying to make a call to this API, and he specifically put this folder structure. So API get customers, and there will be an index file in here that it can reference and make a request from. So now we've made the request, we need to handle the data. So let's go ahead and say new data. And we're going to set that equal to await res.json. And then we can set the data in our useState to the new data. And once you've done that, we can use this functionality anywhere in our application. So let's go ahead and use the useEffect to make a call to that, and we can then look at what is returned from the database. And all we're going to do is do this useEffect, open parentheses, an arrow, and then here we have our what's actually going to happen. And all we're going to do is make a recall to get data. And then to make sure this only runs once, we need to make sure that this is the ending. So 2 open square brackets. At this point, we're ready to go. So go ahead and type the words for sale and dev into your terminal, and then go ahead and hit the default answers to all the questions. And once you've done that, it will launch on localhost 3000, and let's go and check it out. So now we've launched our code here, localhost 3000. As you can see, nothing's happening here, but I have opened the developer tools, and you can see that Get Customers has 3 results here, and inside of each one of those, there's some data, and it has the address, first name, last name, telephone number, etc. So at this point, we're in really good shape. We're actually getting the data back from our database, but we're not displaying it to the user. We're currently looking at a blank screen. So let's go ahead, install Chakra-UI, and start using that to create the rest of our functionality. So here we are back in the code. Just go ahead and install Chakra-UI, which you can see down here is npm install at chakra-ui/core, emotion/core, emotion/style, and emotion theming. Once you've installed all of those, I'll make sure to drop it in the description so you can copy and paste it. You can use these to install our Chakra-UI. Now, once that's installed, we can go ahead and start writing more code. So what I've done is just opened our index.js, and I haven't made any changes yet, but let's go ahead and start making them. So we have this import at the top. We also need to import some Chakra-UI features. So let's do heading, flex, stack, box, button, input, form control. Now this might seem like a lot just to display to the user, but I'm actually pre-fronting this so that you're ready to use these for our form that we're going to use to allow the user to create another one. So form labels, we're also going to use a radio group and radio. And that's all coming from the Chakra-UI core. So now that you've imported all of these, now we're pretty much ready to go. So the first things that we need to do is obviously display something to the user. So first, let's do a heading. And inside of that heading, we're just going to do an h1. So to do that, you do as equals h1. And let's align this to the center as well. So let's just put a little padding around it for the top and the bottom, and do text align equals center. And then we can just type in here something like NEXTJS FAUNA DB and serverless. Now we have that. We can go ahead and add another heading here just underneath that says customer data, so that we know what we're presenting to the user is the customer data next. Next, we need to create a box around the whole thing so that this is contained and has one div element. So this box is actually just a div. You can do anything that you can do with a div with this box. And now if we hit save, we've just got a heading and another heading. Now we need to do what I would call the table that shows the customer data. So let's create a flex element here. And that flex element is going to have a margin at the top of 12, which is not 12, but something like 4 rem. And then we can align this to the center and justify it to the center as well. So that should line up quite nicely. Now what we want to do is do a stack. And a stack in the Chakra-UI world is just a way of saying I want all of these to be contained together. So they're elements that you want to basically stack one on top of the other. So this stack is going to have a bunch of headings here. And we're going to just put a margin on the bottom this time as a H4. And this H4 is just going to have the word name. And then we're just going to copy and paste these down here. And we're going to return name, phone number and credit card. So phone and credit card. And these are the things that we're actually going to return using that serverless function and actually use. So now we have that, what we should do, instead of just taking this data and dumping it here, we should create a component to actually handle this. So let's do that. So inside of your root directory here, not inside the pages, but inside this root, you're going to create a new folder, and that folder is going to be called a components. And inside of that components, we're going to create one new file, and we're going to call it CustomerData.js. And this is just going to handle returning specific pieces in a nice way. So we're going to import some Chakra-UI stuff here. So we're going to use the word divider, stack, text, and box, and they're all coming from Chakra-UI. And that's all we need. And then we're going to export a default function here, and we're going to call it CustomerData. And we're going to take in some properties here. And the properties we're actually going to take in are the same ones we described before. So credit card, first name, and last name, and the telephone. But let's go ahead and actually return something now. So we're going to use a stack, but we're going to use a special kind of stack. It's called isInline. And it's basically going to put them in line. Instead of stacking them on top, it's going to go this way. Then we're going to take the stack and add a box or a div. And inside of there, we're going to add a text. And the text is going to have a nice font size of LG. We're going to add a margin at the top and the bottom of 4, which is the equivalent of 1 rem. And then we're going to add also an MX of the same amount. And that could change based upon your preference, but that's just how I like it here. And inside of that, we're going to do a first name, and then a space, and the last name. And that will take care of the first and last name of our customers. So now we've done that, we actually need to do a divider, which we imported at the top here, and that's just to divide them up. So let's go ahead and type the word divider. And we're going to add a border of 4 pixels. We should add a box at the top here as well, because we need to return at least one parent, so this box will handle that for us. Now we need to basically copy and paste this functionality here and do one for our telephone. So to do that, we're just going to add the word telephone here and remove the last name. And that will take care of our telephone. And then finally, we just need the credit card, which we can do the exact same way. We can just go ahead and pull this and drop in the credit card. So instead of first and last name, we'll just do credit card. And now we're good to go. So we have a first one, that will be the first and last name. Then we're going to display the telephone, and then finally the credit card. So at that point, now we can actually just loop over the data using data.map and present this to the user. So now we've dropped back into our index.js file. We need to actually import our hard work from the components. To do that, just type the word import and then customer data from, and then components / customer data. Now that will give us the ability to use this by mapping over it, and that's what we're going to do now. So in between our stack and our flex in our code, probably around line 46, we're going to actually add in our component that we just created and use that to show our users. So to begin with, we need to actually check to see if there's any data. So we can do data.length is greater than 0, and if it is greater than 0, then we can actually do something with the code. So we're going to map something to the letter D, and we're going to use that to display to our user. So all you need to do is make a request to CustomerData, and then we're going to use key parts of the returned data to display to the user. And if you remember, we had credit card number, first and last name, and the telephone. So when you're mapping over data, you're required to have a key. So we're going to set that key to d.data.telephone. And that's because I don't know anybody with the same telephone number as somebody else. Then we can use credit card, and we're going to do d.data.creditcard and then .number. Because remember, the credit card is an object. So we just actually want the number and not the rest of the information. Then we can do first name is equal to d.data.first name, and then the last name is also going to be equal to d.data.last name, and finally the telephone number, which will be equal to d.data telephone. Now at this point, we can go ahead and close out our component here, and then outside of these two parameters, which will take us to here, we want to actually do the other part of our if statement. So here we're going to do colon and then open another set of parentheses and say, well, if nothing else happens and there's nothing to show, we'll just put a text here and we're just going to write the word loading. And that handles all of our conditional statements. And what we should get now, if we go back to our website, is the data displayed to the user. So here we go. We can now see that the data has been received from our FaunaDB. We've then used it to sort of create a small kind of table here, and it displays the credit card numbers, the telephone numbers, and of course the names. Now it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but it does give you an idea of how this would work. So now what I want to show you is how you can actually insert a new row into the database using a form so that your user, for example, could create their own customers. And then what will happen is we'll actually pull back the data once it's been inserted into the database. So just as before, we're going to create another folder inside of this API, and we're going to call this one new customer. And the new customer is also going to get an index.js file. Now, what we're going to do to save a bit of time and repetitiveness is we're going to take the first sections here and paste them in to our code. Now, you're probably wondering, like, well, why can't you just set these somewhere else as a global variable? But we want to treat these as separate entities. They can be used anywhere in our application, and it shouldn't have to depend on anything else. So for the time being, it's perfectly fine to recall things that you've already done in your application. So I already know that the form data is going to come from the body of the request. So let's go ahead and put that in here, and then we'll create a DB insert based upon that. And then we can modify our front-end code to add the form. So first, let's call const form data, and we're going to set that equal to request.body.data. And that's where our form data is going to be passed into this functionality. And as before, we're going to set a try catch here. And the try is going to be fairly similar as before. So const dbs is equal to await client.query. And now outside of that, everything else gets a little different. So using Q, which remember is the query, we can do something called create. And you're probably thinking, well, that's going to create a whole new database. But it's actually not. The create functionality takes a parameter, and the parameter is a collection. And you can tell it where you want to insert this data. So we're going to tell it we want to insert a new customer into the customers collection, and then we're going to pass it in the data that we need. So inside of here is going to be a data object. And inside of that data object is going to be everything we need to create a new customer. So we're going to have a first name. And that first name is going to be set to form data dot first name. Then we're going to have a last name, and that last name is going to obviously be set to form data dot last name. So far we have two parameters here. Now the address is actually an object. So what we're going to do is we're going to type the word address here, open a set of parentheses here to create an object, and then we're going to pass in everything we need. Street. So that will be form data dot street address, and city is going to be our form data dot city. Then we're going to create one that says state, and that will be form data dot state. And then obviously the zip code, which is important, is going to be form data dot zip code. Then outside of that, we're going to need the telephone number, and that will just be form data dot phone number. And then finally, our last thing is the object for the credit card. Now the credit card takes two objects here. It's going to be credit card, and inside of here, we're going to create network, which to me is the card type. So we're going to call that card type. And then outside of that, the number, which obviously is going to be the form data dot card number. So we're basically inserting each one of these into our database. So now we have that, we need to handle what happens if it's okay, and then obviously what happens when it's not. So we can just set a 200 here, and we'll just say JSON DBS dot data. And then if it doesn't go well and something bad happens, we can set another 500 here, and we'll set this to another JSON, and we'll call it error, and then error dot message. Actually, let's just change this to E to make it easier. And at that point, if we save this, we can just talk through the whole thing as a whole instead of worrying about typing on the keyboard. So we're going to take in the form data, and that's going to come from a request body data. And that will be our form in our index.js file, which we're about to create. Then we're going to ask it to connect to the database, and we're going to ask it to create a collection insert to our customers collection, and we're going to ask it to insert all of this data here. Then if it goes well, we'll respond with a 200 and return back the data, which when you use FaunaDB will just be a return of the data you just inserted. And if it goes terribly, we'll just send a 500 back with an error message. So that part's covered. Now we actually need to cover inserting a new customer. So let's go ahead and do that. So underneath this flex, but between the box and the flex, we're going to add a new heading here. We'll just call this an H4, and we'll add a margin to the top so that it's not pushed up against this part, and we'll give this a 6. And we'll align this in the center so it looks nice to the user. And we'll say this is add a new customer. Then we're going to create another flex here, and this is going to have another margin at the top of 12, and it's going to be aligned in the center with a justified of center as well, so that it sits in the center of our screen. Then what we're going to do is create a form. Now we're going to do a form here, and the form is going to have an on submit like any other form. And for now, we'll just say handle submit. We don't have this functionality right now, but we'll add it in a second. And then the method is going to be equal to post. And the only reason we're doing this is we're going to handle the method. And what will happen is if you don't include this, is that the query strings will be attached to the index of your file. So it'll be like localhost 3000 /?, and then everything that we insert in the form. And we don't need that because we're actually going to take care of it. So now we're going to use something called form control, which is just a Chakra-UI feature. we're also going to have a handle change. So imagine if someone types in, deletes, types in, we want to make sure that we update every time. So we'll do a handle change here, and then we'll start actually creating the form. But before we do that, we should talk about these two and what else we have to insert into our code to make it work the way we think. So at the top here, we have just a state here, and then this functionality that has the useEffect. Well, we actually need some initial form data that we can then fill in with the names that we want to use. So here, before anything else, we're going to create a new constant called initial form data, and it's going to be something called object.freeze. And the freeze is just a definition of the object that we want, and it's essentially a way of locking the attributes to it, and now we can start creating our object. Now this is just going to be each name of the object that we already know about. So it's going to be everything in the database: first name, last name, street address, city, state, zip, phone number, card type, and card number, which matches what we have in this new customer. First name, last name, address, all the address fields, telephone, credit card, network, and number. So I'm going to go ahead and insert them, and I won't let you sit here and watch me type. We'll just go ahead and time lapse through them. Okay, so now we've typed in our initial form data. We also need another state here. So let's create a state called const, and then it's going to be form data and update form data. And we're going to use state, and this time it'll be an object. So now we have this initial form data and the ability to track this data as we're going along. One thing that we do need to do is handle the change. When someone starts typing in the keyboard, we want to be able to track that and make sure it's correct. So what we'll do here is underneath this use, we'll create a handle change and also a handle submit. So handle change is going to take a variable e, and then we're going to update form data, which of course is the name of this part of our state. And we're going to do something you may not have seen before. We're going to use a spread that's going to take in the form data. So that means that we're not overriding it every time, but we're only overriding a particular thing. And then we're going to do e.target.name, and we're going to set this equal to e.target.value. And at that point, this handle change is ready to go. So anytime there's a change, we'll make sure that we update the target name to the new value. The target name will be one of these names here. And we'll make sure that they match so that they update correctly. Then of course, we need to handle the submit. And so for now, we'll just do handle submit. And we're going to take in the E again. And we're going to do e.prevent default. And then we're going to do an AddCustomer method here. Now, the AddCustomer method is essentially going to take everything that we have and pass it down to our API functionality that we created over here for our serverless functions. So what we should do is create that functionality because we already know what's going to happen. But we can wait until we actually have a form to test to make sure that it works. So now we've created the handle submit and obviously the on change handler. We now actually need to create this form. So inside of this form control, we're actually going to do all of our work. Now what's great about Chakra-UI is it basically takes care of everything for us. So let's go and create each part of our form element, and then let's try creating a new customer. So each of our input fields that are text-based are going to be all exactly the same. So to do that, we're going to do a form label, and inside of that form label is going to be the HTML for, and then equal to whatever we want to call it. So for this is going to be first name, and we're going to set this to first name. And now we have the label, then we actually need to do the input. And the inputs are fantastic with Chakra-UI. So you type the word input, type, text, name, equal that to first name. ID equal to first name as well. And then we can just throw on change. And we'll do handle change. And that's all that we need. So we can close this out and our input is now complete. We can actually just copy and paste this and make this our last name as well as our first name. So let's take the form label and then just hit enter here and then change everything that's first name to last name. And then we can just change the actual displayed part to the user. And now we have an input for both first name and last name. And now we need to do the street address. So we can take the same form label again, copy and paste it, and do street name. So we'll do street address here. Same for the IDs. They're going to be street addresses, and then the on change obviously will be handled the same way. Now, before we go any further, I just want to talk about again that on change handler here. So we go back to it. You can see that we're actually looking for the name, and then we're going to set that to the target name. So as long as this name here matches the name in our fields, we'll update it with the latest date. And that's how we're going to do all of our form pieces. Now, the next part is city, state, and zip code. And usually on a form, they're all in a line. So we can do that by using the stack functionality of Chakra-UI here. So you just type the word is in line, and it will make it inline instead of stacked on top of each other. So now that we have the stack, we can just use the same, again, form label here and use that to create what we want. So first, let's change this to street address before we forget. And then we can take this form label, drop it in here and say this one will be our city. And now that we have the city, we just need to do that again for zip code and for the state. So I'll just go ahead and time lapse that. So now that we've done that, now we just need to enter the phone number. So we can just create another form here with the exact same thing. We're going to keep it as text so that it can be a free input field, because we're not going to do any form validation here. Even though you should, and I encourage you to do that, we aren't going to do it for this crash course. Now we need to have the user show us what kind of credit card they have. And instead of making them type in Visa or MasterCard or Amex, we can just use a radio button to handle this for us. So we can do a radio group here, and we'll give it the name of card type. And we'll just add some margin around it. And we'll also add some spacing in between each radio button. And finally, this is also going to be inline, so it will be across the page. And then each radio button is going to be the word radio. It's going to have an on change handler, just like everybody else. And then we're going to give it the name equal to Visa. Then the value will also be Visa. And finally, the label will also be the same. The way that this works, this name is going to be passed when you hit form submit. So that will update that based upon that. Then obviously the on change will flip flop between which one you select. And then the value will be passed down to us. So you can just copy and paste this radio button. There's nothing special about them. They just need to be changed. So we need 3 of them total. So we have Visa. Then we'll do one for a MasterCard. We'll do one for Amex. And we'll call it American Express. And then the final thing that we're going to need is the card number. So the card number we're actually going to do is slightly different. We're actually going to make them type in a number. So you can go ahead and copy one of these input labels here and drop this down outside of this radio group. It's going to be a type of number, and we're going to call this card number. and we're going to ask for the card number. And then we just need to make sure we update the name and the ID. And then the only thing left to do now is, of course, have a button that actually does the submission. So underneath the last input, but in between the form control, we need a button. And we're going to make this a type of submit. And then we're going to add an MY, which is top and bottom margins, which we've used previously. And we'll also add an ML of 20%. Then we'll just make the width 50% of the parent. And the size will be medium. And that will add some just styles and heights. And then the border, we can just set something like 2 pixels, and the border color we can set equal to green.500. And we'll just say add customer. So as you can see now, we have a form at the bottom of our page that we can use to input some data. So let's go ahead and do that. So here we have Steve Jones, 123 Main Street, and his number is 555-555-5555. Then we have a Visa card, and we'll just add some numbers in here. And now if we hit add customer, we should see something happen. So let's go ahead and try. And that's exactly what I expected to happen. We got all the way to the add customer, but we haven't implemented this function yet. So let's go back to the code, implement the function, and then go from there. Add customer functionality is going to work. Is essentially we're just going to pass in a bunch of data to it, and that's going to be from our form. Function is here. Let's create another one, and we'll call this one add customer. And we're going to do an await, fetch, and we're going to do the same thing as we did before, right? API / and then whatever the folder name is. So here it's new customer. And now we need to actually send some request options down. Now, if you've never done a fetch with a post, we're going to need a few things. So just underneath our form data here, we're going to create another constant, and it's going to be our request options. And we're going to set the method to post. We're going to set the headers, and the content type here is going to be application JSON, because we're going to send it JSON down. And then finally, we need to actually send something in the body, right? So the body is going to contain our form data. So to do that, we're just going to do body, and then we're going to do JSON.stringify, and then data form data. And then we can take this, send this down. So we can just go comma, request options. And then we can do then, and then say, after we've done that, go ahead and get the data, because we know it's successful. So go ahead and get the data. And then if not, catch the error, and we'll just log the error out. So now let's go ahead and flip back to our website and see if we can now submit a form. So let's hit F12 and let's see what happens. And as you can see up here, Steve Jones has now been added. So let's go ahead and clear that out, and we'll add somebody else. How about if we add Tom Jones, and Tom Jones's phone number is 898-898-898. And he lives now in, I don't know, Mystic, which is also in Connecticut, but I have no idea what the zip code is. So let's do that one. And we'll change his credit card number here too. And there you go. Tom Jones has now been added to our database. So there we go, guys. NEXTJS and FaunaDB working together perfectly. So we had a form at the bottom to add a new customer using the collection of customers. And then we also had the table at the top that presented any new user that we had. If you did enjoy the content, make sure to drop it a like, hit subscribe because I'll be dropping more content like this in the future. And of course, don't forget that notification bell. Until next time, see ya.